Okay, we're getting down to the point finally where we probably got this week and next week where we will finish up Hosea. Just to kind of give you a brief overview, if you remember, the first 3 weeks was all about the metaphor of Hosea and Gomer and their relationship, which clearly showed that he was a sovereign God. Then in chapters 4 through 10, which we will talk about 10 later today. It's mostly the discussions about sin and iniquity and judgment and things. And then in chapters 11 through 14, deal more with the restoration and repentance. But I will say that there's still a lot of sin and charges and iniquity sprinkled throughout all of these chapters. So just when you think you see a light at the end of the tunnel, well, then here comes another train. It's like you just can't let it go. And so, so chapter 10, it starts out kind of with a continuation of God's charges against the northern kingdom. He uses the empty vine, and there's a lot of references to vines in the Bible. It seems to be one of the most common metaphors that are out there. But and just like with Gomer, Israel is charged with gross corruption of the worship of God, and the vine itself, it's not saying that it's not producing, but what the metaphor is trying to say here is that when the vine is growing its produce or whatever, they are stripping it clean. They're not leaving any on the vine. They're taking all of the material and they're taking it all for themselves. And by that, it means he's not giving a fair share to God or others. They're taking it all. What they don't use for their own, they're giving it to Baal. And so it mentions that their heart is divided, but it's not divided down the middle, obviously. It's not 50-50. It's more like a 80-20 relationship. We talked about and joked before about, an atheist doesn't have a backup plan. Well, these Israelites had a backup plan, but unfortunately, God was the backup plan. It wasn't that he was their first choice. It's just that, they worship Baal first. And then if that didn't work out well, then God was going to be their second choice. So the early parts of chapter 10 then more or less describe that, God's not happy with them. And while they have taken all of their fruits and their labors and everything and built up the altars and the sacred pillars to Baal, God's now going to do in judgment what they should have done in contrition, which is they should have been destroying the altars and the pillars themselves, and instead of leaving it to God. And then the second part then he also goes into the discussion of their powers and their government and stuff, and God is pointing out again that these weren't his kings, they weren't his princes and things, but so under the judgment of the Lord, he's like, you want a idolatrous king? Again, I'm going to give you an idolatrous king, just like we talked last week. They wanted Assyria, he's going to give them Assyria. Yeah. And so and that's the warning, I think, that we have to constantly think about when we vote on things or select our politicians and everything else, is that our country continues to go out to other foreign powers and stuff and reach out to them for our relationships and our energy and everything else, and our financial policies, fiscal policies. And one of these days, God's going to say, you want China and OPEC? I'm going to give you China and OPEC. So we just got to be very, very careful about what we wish for in this nation. Verse 4 also describes more of the lying and the deceit of Israel. The fact that they're not being truthful with themselves or with God themselves. And he talks about how there's the one particular sentence in there that says, New King James Version, thus judgment springs up like a hemlock in the furrows of the field. For those of you that are not aware of farming, maybe you will remember some of your high school literature, but hemlock is poisonous. And so what they're saying is if you're not careful, poisonous ideas, speech, and things like that are going to spring up in your day-to-day activities, and that's not beneficial at all. And if you remember, hemlock was one of the poisons of choice in at least one, if not more, of the Shakespearean plays and things. It was a mug of hemlock that did in Macbeth, I believe it was. So the chapter then also goes on to talk about the golden calves and things. If you recall, Jeroboam the first had erected these two golden calves, as we talked about, in the northern kingdom, so that his people didn't have to go to Judah or to Jerusalem to worship. So he created his own idols and everything. But they're pointing out here that those are just trinkets, more or less. They were nothing more than shiny gold to the Assyrians, because Assyrians didn't worship Baal. Now, they worshiped about 10 other false deities and things, but Baal was not one of them. So to them, that wasn't something that they needed to praise, cherish, or preserve. To them, that was nothing. And so they were able to them, they were breaking them up into small pieces and hauling them back to Assyria, just like they would any other trinket or treasure that they found when they went in to destroy a region or a city. And it also then it goes on to say, talks more too, that Israel seemed more upset by the loss of their idols than the loss of their freedom, even though these predictions were going to be, that you're going to be going back into captivity and everything. They were mourning the loss of their temples, to Baal and everything. To them, it was so bad. They just wanted to be buried right there on the spot where the temples were. They still weren't praying to God or asking for anything. They were just devastated that they no longer had temples where they could worship. And it's kind of a sad day when you get to that point, that you think your life is over because of your sin. Verse 9 then goes on. It reminds them again of Gibeah. We talked about Gibeah last week. Gibeah seems to be a focal point for a lot of this. But Gibeah was referenced not only because of the battle that almost wiped out the tribe of Benjamin. Later on, there's going to be another discussion about that. But even though they had all these warnings, and we've seen that throughout the Bible, from Exodus all the way up through Judges and everything, that it doesn't seem to be how many warnings there are. Iniquity and sin is still prevalent amongst the people. And so the same could be said of the entire northern kingdom, and not just Gibeah itself. There is a verse in here that talks about two transgressions. Commentaries don't all agree on what that verse means. Some believe that it's a reference to the two golden calves that were created, that those were the two transgressions. Another commentary that I read believes that the two transgressions are the corruption of idolatry and the corruption and the evil that played out in the politics and things. So, but the interesting thing is I don't think you can narrow it down to just two transgressions. I mean, The whole northern kingdom has just been daily, all day long, and everything else, whether it was creating idols or doing evil, murders, thieving, stealing, not taking care of people. There was more than two transgressions, but seems to be that they're trying to make these the cause and the effect of different things. Verse 11 then compares Israel to a heifer on the threshing floor, and we talked in Ruth and different things about how a threshing floor, what they would do is they would yoke an oxen or a cattle or something to a skid, who would then just sit there and walk around in circles, and they would throw the grain of the plants and everything in front of it. And what that would do is that would slowly separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and help break that down. So think about the cow that's doing this work, is that it's not hard work. It's just pulling a skid. And if it gets hungry, all it's got to do is just lower its head and eat a little bit. But what God's saying here is you're no longer going to be like the heifer on the threshing floor. God was going to treat them like unruly animals, and he was going to put a yoke on their necks, and he was going to hitch them up to a plow, and then they were going to spend all of their time plowing fields, breaking up clods and everything. And typically you didn't just do one pass on a field. You had to keep going it over and over and over until you got it broken down. So he's going to hook them up to a more sinister device and let them experience the hardships of the exile. So I sent out some questions ahead of time. And question one, if you remember in chapter 8 warns of sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind. And again, this is from a misplaced desire. But then verse 12 in chapter 10 starts describing, a very similar situation, but it seems to be from a different position than what the description was in verse 8. So there's four parts or four components to that verse, and I wanted to see if anybody could break down any of those various parts and explain how that verse could be applied to all of us for being better Christians. And let me just read it. It says, "Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord till he comes and rains righteousness on you." So who wants to volunteer to break down part of that?
Well, I liked the way it was a cycle. When it says plant good seeds of righteousness, that seemed to be what was missing back in chapter 8, where they were planting the wind and harvesting the whirlwind. And so I got to thinking, where do you get those good seeds of righteousness? And it comes from the last part of this verse where it says, the Lord will shower his righteousness on you. So it's sort of like a growing cycle that you get the righteousness from God, you plant it, and then it grows into love. And then you can harvest, you can tend it by plowing up your hard hearts, and then you harvest it. So yeah, I like the cyclical part to it.
Yeah, and you named three of the four things that I was going to name, and the fallow ground is a metaphor for your heart and stuff. If your heart is hardened and you're not thinking in a Christian manner or whatever, then you're not going to act Christian. You're not going to do Christian things, and so you got to break that up. The one thing that I also had added that I kind of read and learned about, the part about reap in mercy. This kind of goes back to the discussion of the vine, where they were completely stripping the vine of everything, and reaping in mercy. Remember back in Ruth, Keith just got a light bulb moment. What were they supposed to do when they reaped the fields? back in the days of Ruth and everything. What were they supposed to do?
Supposed to leave some.
Supposed to leave the outer rows and stuff along the roads and the perimeters of the field, so that the less fortunate and things could eat as well too. So you're right on that. We also, it's okay to be prosperous and that kind of stuff, but you have to leave or give a portion of your blessings and everything, so that others can also do that as well too. So yeah, I think we got all four parts of what I was looking for on this. Go ahead, Keith.
I was thinking our hearts are actually, it's referring to our minds, and so far as our actions are concerned, I think we need to renew our minds, as Romans 12:2 says.
What's it say?
Pardon?
You said as Romans 12:2 says, and I said, okay,
Yeah.
what's it say?
It's talking about renewing our minds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I tried to apply the reaping and stuff, I mean, to government and everything as well too. It seems like the vote that just happened on last Friday and everything, it seems like, yeah, we're trying to help the unfortunate, but it's going to be through a forced, I'm going to take from you and give to them kind of scenario. So it's not being done with a Christian background, so to speak, or a thankfulness of our blessings and things like that. It's I kind of wonder sometimes about that as well too. Yes, sometimes they're doing good, but maybe for all the wrong reasons, because we'll talk about that some more in a little bit. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Well, I also think the plowing up the hard ground of your hearts can be the fruits of the Spirit too. If you look at those fruits, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, those are all softening agents as opposed to selfish, hard agents. So I thought of that.
Right. Yeah, and when a field, it's kind of talking about a fallow field and stuff too. It's when you allow it to be hard for a long time. It's harder to break up in different things. If you plow your field every year, it's usually not as bad. But when you have let your heart or your fields go fallow for years or whatever, it can be even harder that first time to do that softening and everything as well too. So that's a good point, Linda.
Yep.
Going back to what Keith said, that Romans 12:1 and 2, it talks about transforming yourself, which to me indicates the need for change, and that God doesn't want us to be complacent, but ever ready to continue to grow.
Yep.
Just picking up on that, talks about transforming ourselves by the renewing of our minds. And I think that in large part comes from reading and studying the scriptures, because that's what brings the change in our hearts. So kind of all of that just goes together.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Very, very good discussion. So, okay, moving forward then, chapter 10, then also verse 12, then starts like we just said, verse 12 describes a righteous way to plow. Then it seems that he goes right back. This is the part about chapters 10 and 11 that kind of, I guess, I wouldn't say irritated, but it just kind of confused me that we would go to these positive places and then we would go back down to the negative. And then let's go positive, let's go negative. So here he just got through telling him, okay, here's what you need to do to be righteous and that kind of stuff. But then he goes, but you didn't do it. So,
Yeah.
chapter 13, he goes back to say, but you sown and reaped from the bad place. And again, and so it's like, it almost reminds me of, parents. Well, this is what you could do, but you didn't do it. Here's what you did. And that kind of, it's almost like he's, I don't want to use the word nagging, but he said, but you've plowed in wickedness, you have reaped iniquity, you have eaten the fruit of lies because you trusted in your own way and the multitude of your mighty men. So he's going right back to the negative again on this. So it's hard to say that verse 10 and 11 are all about love, because he's still reminding them of their sinful ways and everything. Goes on to say, instead of prospering, they have yielded nothing because they trusted in their own ways instead of in God's ways. So had they been plowing and sowing in love as opposed to greed and sin, if they would have followed God's ways instead of their own ways, they might have a completely different yield, so to speak. And in response to Israel's pride, and the Lord said, he's going to destroy the source of their false confidence. They had started building fortresses and things like that all around, so that if they ever did have to fight off battles, that they could. But the Lord's going to take care of that as well too. The second half, and this is what I referenced earlier, the second half of verse 14 has multiple possible references. It says, as Shalman plundered Beth Arbel in the day of battle, a mother dashed in pieces upon her children. Again, there's the commentaries are not completely in agreement. A couple commentaries have said that that could be Shalmaneser. There was a couple different kings named Shalmaneser that came in, and Assyrian kings. But the one that was that a lot of them kind of agree that is most likely, there was a Moabite king named Solomonu, and that translates to Shalman as well too. But the reason why they thought that this Moabite king might have been the right ones is he was in the period of the time when Hosea would have been speaking, around 740 BC, and he had ruled at about that same time. He had waged battle on Beth Arbel, and this battle was vividly remembered by a lot of people at that time for its atrocities, because Solomonu and his warriors and stuff would come in and be extremely destructive, and they performed wholesale slaughter of women and children. So that kind of goes with this verse, because it talks about Shalman plundering Beth Arbel, and he says a mother dashed in pieces on her children. So it shows that they weren't lucky enough to be led back into slavery like most. They were completely destroyed and killed. And then verse 15, which is the last verse of chapter 10, talks about, thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great wickedness. At dawn, the king of Israel shall be cut off utterly. So that verse is predicting that not Hosea, the prophet, but Hoshea, who was the last king of the northern kingdom. That verse is predicting that he's going to be the last king. There will be no more dynasties in the northern kingdom from the previous dynasties, because as we know, there is David's dynasty will once again rule over the entire region and area, but this one's predicting that when the Assyrians come and take out Hoshea, that the northern kingdom is going to be completely destroyed. I'll give a second here for this quote to come up. One of the commentators referenced this quote, and he's basically saying you get the leader that you deserve. this J. Vernon McGee, and I didn't know much about him, but he was a long time, old time radio pastor and stuff before there were TVs and things, and would give his sermons on the radio. And he had a quote that said, "Godless people cannot elect a righteous leader." And you probably could have stopped with that sentence right there for me, because that's very true. Like I said, you're going to get the leader that you deserve, but if the majority of your people are liars, then you're going to get a liar as a leader. If the majority of your people are adulterers, they will get an adulterer. Adultery is just another kind of lying. And if they are thieves, that's the kind of leader that they will have. And so, again, I constantly say this. I think we need to apply some of this, what we're learning, to our lives. And I would love to see our country get a righteous leader. And we had that conversation several weeks ago, that we probably haven't had one really since Jimmy Carter. Unfortunately, righteous leaders don't poll very well, and they can't raise a lot of money, I think, is the big issue. And then naturally politics is driven by polls and funding. And I don't know what we do to fix it, but there may be a light on the horizon where some people are starting to want to return back to the old ways, when God was in our schools and in our courtrooms and in our political bodies and everything. So we can only hope. Chapter 11 then starts the discussion about God's continuing love for Israel, and it starts out very soft and gentle, and you think that, okay, now this was going to be that this whole entire chapter is going to be positive, but hang on. The last 4 chapters of Hosea are intended to show the love of God and what can happen if they repent, and that they will be restored. But chapter 11 starts out with God remembered his tender love for Israel when more than 500 years before the time of Hosea, he brought them out of Egypt in the times of Exodus. And this verse then also foretells that his son will come from Egypt. So this is a prophecy then of Jesus Christ, even in the book of Hosea, that his son will come from Egypt. So as we know, all the way back from Adam through Abraham and David and so forth, the lineage of Jesus Christ did come through Egypt along the way. So he's hinting or starting to tell the tale of what's to come. Then the second verse then says, this one was kind of a difficult verse to understand. Verse 2 said, "As they called them, so they went from them." Well, when you have a sentence with nothing but pronouns, it's hard to really clarify what they're trying to say. But so I had to go to the sources, and probably the best description that I could find says that the first "they," as they called them, is probably speaking about the prophets. It's that as the prophets called out to Israel, the more Israel rejected the prophets. So they went from them. So they're calling for them. They're giving them the message, and then they're just turning their backs to them and walking away. So Israel is rejecting the messages from God that's going through the prophets there. And it says, as they went away from God, they continued to sin and idolatry. So they couldn't give up, that tug or that pull that they had fell into. Verse 3 then starts to soften and starts to describe a metaphor of a parent teaching a child to walk by holding the child's arm and supporting them as they learn to walk. And it says, "I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle work, with bands of love, and I was to take them as those who take the yoke from their necks. I stooped and fed them. So he's pointing out, I do things for you that you don't even know about. I mean, the prosperity that they've been experiencing, like we talked before, that's all coming from God, but they don't know it. They think it's coming from Baal. And says God does so much for his people, yet they're oblivious to it. And then God likens himself to one who actually makes their life easier. He takes the yoke again off their neck, and he tells them how he has stooped low to feed them. So it's, he's trying to point out that, everything I've done for you. So this kind of instilled another question in me. It says, chapter 11 describes some very parental traits. And so the question was, do you see God's love as more of a mother or a father? And if you do choose one, please explain.
Actually, I think as human beings, we think of a mother's love as being probably the greatest human love. I'm not sure, but in that respect, you could look at God's love as a mother's love. But I think God's love actually transcends all other love.
Yeah, and then one of the things I thought too is, sometimes our Father's love, a lot of times was portrayed as discipline, right?
Yes, right.
Mom would give us cookies and say, "Wait till your father gets home." But our Father's love, it's like, I'm not enjoying this, but you're gonna get the belt today, and so you can see both maternal and paternal throughout the Bible and everything.
Yeah, I see that.
So I think it depends on which chapter or which verse you're reading, but it could be a little bit of both. The tenderness side of thing does come across maternally, but like you said, Keith, God's love, really transcends any of those. But we tend to paint the picture of our past experiences and things as well too.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't know if anybody saw the movie The Shack or even read the book The Shack that was out several years ago, but in that movie, God the Father was presented as a woman. And it took me a long time to wrap my head around that whole casting of that part, because I guess I had always pictured God the Father. And
Right.
So it was kind of an eye-opening thing for me. But I agree with Keith. I think that God's love is way above any kind of human love that we can experience.
Right. Yeah, and when we get closer to the end of chapter 11, we're going to kind of separate God from humankind a little bit as well too, because again, we are projecting human experiences onto God as well too, because it's hard to paint a picture of him any other way. But so many times in the book and in prayers, it's God the Father, and there's a lot of arguing about whether or not that's true or not, because it's really, he is God. So continuing on, God through Hosea mentions again the symbolic return to Egypt. While some of the people might have fled to Egypt or went to Egypt and stuff on their own or whatever, God, he's reminding that even though Egypt is the metaphor for bondage and slavery, they're going to be delivered to Assyria because they refuse to repent. And we talked about that a little bit last month, or I'm sorry, last week or the week before, that, Egypt probably didn't want to have anything to do with Israel. It's like, no, we've been there. We got the t-shirt, been there, done that. We're not doing that again. So the Assyrians, became the method of oppression then this time. And the verses also talk about, again, and we mentioned this about Sodom and Gomorrah, it wasn't the act of the sin that got them that in trouble that much as it was their stubborn failure to repent after the sin. Sodom and Gomorrah, they condoned the sin, which was probably the biggest thing. But then after the sin was committed, nobody's repenting. And that's the part that's the most troubling to God in this situation. Verse 7 even talks about them backsliding and things. And this points out that, in order to backslide, you would have had to have been in a good place to begin with. So this is indicating that Israel once had a closer covenant relationship and that they did once walk with God, but now that they're backsliding back into their old ways and different things, and forgetting history to some bit. The verse, but after that, then also, or part of that verse also states that they would still call out to God in a formal way, but it's more symbolic. And that's where like we said too, they have a divided heart, but the biggest chunk of their heart is going to Baal and not to God. So they're calling out to God, saying, "Oh, they're doing their prayers and they're doing worship and stuff, but they're not doing it sincerely, and they're not really exalting Him. They're not fearing Him. They don't have faith in Him. They're just going through emotion. So again, they're using God as their backup plan."
Yeah.
Verse 8 then shows God's continuing love and sympathy for Israel. Let me see what that one said. Because he's like, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboam?" I mean, you can almost see the God is sad right here. It's like someone looking at their children and what am I going to do with you and things. And it's like, even though the dark clouds of judgment are on the horizon, God's not taking any pleasure in what's about to happen, even though they deserve it. And just wanted to point out, Admah and Zeboam, those were 2 of the 5 cities that were destroyed along with Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he's saying, how can I completely wipe you off the face of the earth? He even though you may deserve this, I'm not going to give you that severe of a punishment. So he's kind of explaining that he's going to be soft on them, or he's not going to give them. And we do that with our kids, and sometimes we don't punish them harsh enough, and then they turn around and do it again and things. So God was going to cast a lesser sentence this time around. And looking back through history, you'll wonder, God has given people so many second chances and stuff. When is he not going to? One of these days he's going to get so furious. So this next chapter then kind of talks about God's fierceness of his anger. And throughout Hosea, God has repeatedly spoke through this book and reminded the Israelites of past punishment for terrible iniquity. And I'm going to list some. I mean, he left out some that he also could have added. He could have told the story of Noah, where he pretty much wiped out the whole entire earth and different things, but he didn't. But he does mention Jezreel, where a king's dynasty was slaughtered. He mentions the valley of Achor, where an entire family was stoned to death for the sin of just one person. He mentions Gibeah multiple times, where their actions almost completely destroyed the entire tribe of Benjamin. He mentions a lot of cities that were completely destroyed for their sin. He reminds them of when they were slaves in Egypt. And time again, God is reminding them of the outcome of sin, and still they continue to live without fear of God and just do what they want to do. And you could almost picture God, he's just so angry. He just wants to pick him up and just shake him. Just wants to shake him until nothing. Like he wants to shake the life out of them because they're not listening, they're not learning, and they're not heeding his warnings. And but we're no different. I mean, there's our world and our nation doesn't seem to heed God's warnings sometimes either. And all we can do is hope that we move forward. But like we said, God's not going to shake the stuffing out of him. He's not going to destroy him. But he this is where he talks about the differences between being a God and a common man. He says, "For I am God, not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come with terror." So he said, you know, if I was a common man, you'd all be gone, because my anger and stuff would be so much that I couldn't take it anymore. But I'm a God. I am a loving God and different things. So I'm not going to do what you've got coming to you. So the long suffering, forgiveness, and compassion of the Lord toward his people seems unbelievable until we recognize that he is not man, but God, and his love and forgiveness are of a completely different order than what we would experience in our day-to-day lives. So the chapters then start to conclude. Chapter 11, he kind of talks about God as a lion again. If you remember previously, and I think we'll read in chapter 13 later, the lion metaphor is used as a predator that's going to come in and cut them to pieces and destroy them, eat them, drag them back to their lair and so forth. But here in verse 10 of chapter 11, the comparison of God as a lion is more positive. It's one as a divine lion that's leading the Israelites as they are restored to the land. And you can almost picture Simba, you know, up there on that rock roaring, and all of the other animals that would normally be eaten are bowing to him and different things. So that symbology and stuff is kind of makes it into our movies and stuff from time to time. There's a couple of verses there that talk about trembling. His sons shall come trembling from the west, and they shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt. This trembling signifies, you know, the submissive excitement at hearing the Lord's voice and knowing that he's going to restore them. Verse 12, which is, it's broken up kind of odd because my Bible starts off with a new section, but it's verse 12 is the first verse in that section, and then it jumps to chapter 12. But verse 12 is confusing, as we just read several verses of love and restoration. And then again, we go right back to accusations and charges and stuff. So verse 12 says, Ephraim has encircled me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God, even with the Holy One who is faithful. So it's just jumping all over the place that but he's still trying to say, you know, Israel, you're really evil. Judah's still with me, but you're not. And it's, again, it was kind of confusing the way he jumps all around there and different things.
It's sort of like he's telling them what's ultimately going to happen through verse 11. And then he goes back into verse 12 and so forth. They're still not doing what they should.
All right. No, I agree. And the thing is, you know, they didn't get it after 500 years of history, and they didn't get it after 7 chapters of the Bible. I don't, this constant back and forth and stuff is, it's like a constant reminder, I guess, that he doesn't want him to be lulled to sleep with these dreams of restoration and stuff. But he points out again, but you're still lying to me, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the confusing part. So I thought this would be a good time then to talk about the attributes of God's message in Hosea, and how does that differ from Jesus's message in the Gospels? Because if you set them apart and put them in parallel, they're similar messages, but they're coming from a different place, so to speak. So did anybody get where I was going with this question? Well, we know God's message is coming from a place of love, but it doesn't kind of come across that way sometimes. God is very much a disciplinarian, and he punishes them repeatedly for their sins, where now Jesus is coming with a whole new message, which is almost entirely a message of grace and love and things. Because you know, I could be wrong. I'm definitely not a full scholar and that kind of stuff, but I don't know how often Jesus ever said, if you don't do this, you're going to burn in hell, or you're going to suffer my wrath or my Father's wrath. He might give metaphors or different things about, you know, how being rich isn't going to get you there and different things. But he's pretty much telling a much softer, gentler story. And it kind of goes back to the motherly versus fatherly type of description. So does anybody else kind of see what I'm think I'm saying, or am I
Yeah,
way off base?
I do. You know, in Hosea, you've got a lot of God talking about judgment, and Jesus doesn't stress that.
Right.
Jesus has a kinder presentation as a whole, although he does criticize people and, you know, and so forth. It's just a different type of message.
Yeah, Jesus's message is almost passive aggressive, so to speak. I
Yeah.
guess he kind of chastises them tenderly. You know, he's very polite when he's telling them that they're sinners, and where God's the back of the hand kind of message delivery and stuff. And I could almost see that by the end of this period with the northern and southern kingdoms, God's almost ready to just skip the rest of the Bible and go straight to Revelation. I mean, he's kind of had it here, but
Yeah.
but he thinks about it for what, 400 years of silence and that kind of stuff, and says, okay, I'm gonna give him one more chance. I'm gonna send my son down there. Maybe he can get through to him. And so that's my my assumptions in all of this, I guess, to some degree.
I guess I see that a little differently, because I think Jesus comes across in our reading of the Gospels as kinder and gentler. But I mean, like, he calls the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, whitewashed tombs, which is about as kind of in your face as you can get to call a religious leader something like that. I think the messages are the same. I do think in the Old Testament, we have tended to focus more on kind of the wrath of God. But I mean, if you look at this, you know, he's having a lot of compassion in the book of Hosea, even though a lot of it seems very judging, the underlying thing is still the message of the gospel. I mean, that's the Old Testament is the message of the gospel, just as the New Testament is. I think God seems more wrathful in the Old Testament sometimes, but sometimes I wonder if that's the way that we've been taught to look at that, and that Jesus is more passive in the New Testament. But I think you're right in saying it would be almost passive aggressive, because I mean, he is very judgmental when he went to the temple and threw the, the tables of the
Turn the tables over. Yeah.
yeah, and he talks about those who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So sometimes I think it's easy to miss the gospel in the Old Testament, kind of because how we've been taught about that. But I really think it's the same message ultimately. And I wonder if we had been raised like in a different culture, if our view of the Old Testament and the New Testament would be a little more balanced. I don't know, but sometimes I wonder that.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I think the best way to boil it down, like you said, it's both very similar messages and stuff, but I think it's tone of voice is what we're talking about here, to some
Right.
degree. And I've talked to a lot of people, and you hear some people that say, I don't enjoy, or I don't understand, and I don't like the Old Testament. They prefer to read the New Testament and that kind of stuff. And so you sit back and wonder sometimes, what if there had never been an Old Testament and that kind of stuff? Would you have considered the wrath of God that much? Because you didn't really hear the wrath come out that much in the New Testament and stuff until you get to Revelation, I guess. But if I had a choice of being led to Assyria with a fish hook in my lip versus being called a whitewashed tomb, I'd probably take the whitewashed tomb. I'll take the name calling any day,
Right.
so to speak. But yeah, it is a softer, gentler chastisement as well, I'd say. So, and I think other things too is I always troubled or got conflicted or confused because, the Old Testament was always supposed to be based on the law. And if you didn't abide by the law, you weren't going to make it. And it was finally after Christ and the grace came that people had second chances. And so you kind of wonder, is that the message that people had ingrained in their mind, that I've already sinned, so repenting's not going to get me to the table? I don't know. You don't know how the messages were being displayed then as well either. We've got the benefit of 4,000 years of history here in this book to kind of understand it. So,
And yet, as I read through the Old Testament, I marvel at the many times that God says, come back to me, how he pleads for people to come and have that relationship with him. So I agree with everything that everybody said, but I see that too in the Old Testament as I read through it.
Well, when you think about it, the scriptures that they used in the early church were the Old Testament scriptures. And so I don't think God's plan for salvation, it's anyone who was saved in the Old Testament was through grace. And he had Christ in mind from the beginning, because Christ was in the beginning with God. And so, I just was listening to a sermon this morning by Kevin DeYoung, and he said that one of his favorite questions when people are candidating for ordination is to ask someone to explain how they would show the gospel in one of the minor prophets. And he doesn't let them choose Jonah because Jonah would be kind of easy. But I feel like the gospel is all over the Old Testament, and that, like, I have not realized that until much more recently. And now when I look at it, just like Sherry said, I mean, he's constantly calling people back to himself. And I think the gospel is all over that, because that's how they reasoned with people from the scriptures in the early days, even when Christ was there, because they didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and everything else.
Yep. Agreed. Well, this one's been a pretty good study with a lot of good discussions from everybody. I really appreciate all that. It is just a few minutes after 10 o'clock. So next week, I think we'll be able to wrap up. Chapters 12 through 14 are somewhat short, and we'll kind of continue on with what we've discussed today. Go ahead and read through those chapters. Read day 5 of your study guide, pages 41 through 43, and we will wrap up with Hosea. So I will, oops, I'm gonna stop the recording here. I will go ahead and lead us in prayer today, and